This is the last talk of our day, end of the event, and it's from the keynote speaker, Dr. Marta Garrido. She was invited by us to present her work at Cognitio 2021, and we are really happy that she's here with us today. Dr. Garrido is a neuroscientist. She leads the Cognitive Neuroscience and Computational Psychiatry Laboratory at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne, where she's an associate professor. She is the Chief Investigator at the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Integrative Brain Function. And Marta initially trained in engineering physics at the University of Lisbon and then received her PhD in neuroscience from the University College London in 2008. The main goal of her lab is to understand how the brain learns and makes predictions about future events while adapting to the contingencies of novel environments. Her presentation today is entitled Bayesian Account of Autistic Perception, and I will let her take it away from here.
Thank you so much for a very nice introduction, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's an honor to be here and speak to you. So a few words of warning. Well, first of all, you already noticed that I am a bit of a dinosaur. It's the first time I'm using Gadaton, so bear with me for any issues. The second thing is we're still on lockdown in Melbourne, so I'm at home with two little kids, so they may or may not make an appearance. I'm hoping that they'll be quiet. Okay, so yeah, the last warning is that this is I decided to give a new talk because I was getting a bit bored of my prepared slides from a previous talk. And I also thought it would be more fun in this young context to give a talk on a paper that it's not out yet. And so I'll be really keen to hear your feedback. So let me share my screen. And please interrupt me if there's any issues with the slides or if you can't hear me. Okay, so today I'll be talking about Bayesian accounts of autistic perception. So Bayesian inference is something that I've been kind of obsessed about for a very long time. But only a few years ago, when a student of mine, Roshini Randania, joined the lab, I actually thought about doing to test some of these ideas in autism. And that was really prompted by her saying, well, I would really like to be in your lab, but I want to study autism. And at the time I thought, but I don't really know a lot about autism, but I knew a few things about Bayesian inference. And so what happened is what you'll see in the next few slides. So a few notes about Bayesian inference, and let's bring this back to some real life experiences, which I'm not having much of it at the moment with lockdown, but hopefully eventually. So we are in a concert and we're listening to very nice song that we know by heart. From the first notes of that song, you are able to guess what they are going to sound like. So it's quite a common experience, I believe, for all of us. And of course, these are professional musicians, so mistakes don't really happen, but they might improvise or they might make some arrangements that make it a little bit surprising. And so, of course, if you hear the song take a different route from what you are used to in your, from what you listen to at home, then you'll be surprised. So if we were able to put an EEG machine or some electrodes around your head, we will see a very big response in the brain to that surprising sound or that surprising change in the auditory environment. So this sort of phenomena has been explained in terms of Bayesian models, such that the brain is able to learn about the regularities that go on in the world. And when those learned regularities don't match the actual input, then there is a very big prediction error. And so the learned regularities might be your prior, so your prior information about what the next few minutes are going to sound like, and that prior is based on your previous experience. You know this song, you have a CD at home, not CD, see, another dinosaur thing. You listen to that at home, but in the live concert it is quite different. So what is happening currently as the input into your ears is your current sensory information, and in this case is fairly unambiguous, but there are situations where the current information is actually quite ambiguous or uncertain, and so having prior information is useful to resolve that ambiguity, and that's why Bayesian models have been really so popular in understanding perception and cognition. So another example, which I think illustrates the Bayesian principles of brain and behavior for perception and cognition, is over here. So you may or may not have seen this image before. If you've never seen this image before, all you see is sort of patches, black and white patches, and nothing too interesting. However, if you see this object over here, you might identify it as a dog or some sort of animal. And then once you see this image again, you can't not see the dog again. And so I think that really demonstrates that perception is not just sensory information. It's actually a combination of prior information and sensory information. So again, this is an ambiguous image. Can you see my cursor when I move?
Yes, no problem.
Right. So again, this is a ambiguous image. We might try to make sense of it with whatever priors we have. If I hadn't, the first time I showed you, you didn't really have a prior for this image, so you couldn't really recognize anything from this quite ambiguous information. But then once you see it, then you've got a prior that you can fill in or you can use to resolve that ambiguity, and then you can say, oh, actually, this image represents an animal. So I think this is a good demonstration that perception depends on prior experience, and it also tells us that the brain is not really a passive machine registering information from our senses, but it is actively trying to infer what's going on in front of us. Here's another example, the Kanizsa illusion. So I would ask everybody how many triangles they can see on the screen, and for most of you, you'd say 2. In fact, the actual reality is that there's no triangles drawn in on this screen, but your brain can infer or can fill in lines over here and over there, and sort of imagine, you can imagine in your head that there's actually 2 triangles. So I think, again, this is another nice demonstration that perception is not passively registering information from the environment. It is an active process where we fill in with information that we have from our prior experiences in order to make sense of what we see and hear. And again, it depends on prior knowledge. Now, what does this have to do with autism? So it turns out that autistic individuals are less prone to the Kanizsa illusion, and this has been shown by Francisca Hape many, many years ago now. So the question is really why? Why is it that autistic individuals actually see things more the way they are in this case? So they don't actually have the illusion of seeing triangles of in this image. And so different theories have been put forward around ideas of stronger bottom-up sensory information. So autistic perception being more accurate due to the perception of bottom-up information. So the information that comes from the environment to our senses being more precise. Another point of view argues that actually it's not about the bottom-up information, it's the top-down or prior effect. So there's a weaker top-down effect, so there's weaker priors that what the representation of a triangle is in people's head. So there's been evidence of for and against both of these accounts, and the data is really quite messy. Now, in 2012, these sort of bottom-up, top-down ideas have been formalized in a mathematical model or a Bayesian account, and that's really when I got excited about testing ideas of autistic perception with a Bayesian framework. And so to formalize, so this is a bit of a busy slide, so just bear with me. Let's focus on A first. So we can formalize Bayesian perception in terms of prior experiences, memories, and so forth. That's in blue. And then we've got sensory information in red. So these are the things that you can hear, the things that you can see, and quite often these things can be ambiguous, and so we don't know for sure the exact causes of the sensory environment. But what we can do is to make an inference to guess what is it that we're seeing, like the case of the dog on the screen. So we had some ambiguous information. We try to infer, sort of reconstruct in our head what does that messy information mean. So in Bayesian terms, what the proposal is that in perception, we actually combine the prior information with the sensory information, and at the end, our percept is actually drawn from a posterior. Okay, so mathematically speaking, we've got if we assume that priors are Gaussian and the sensory information is also represented by a Gaussian, then we can integrate the prior and the likelihood and have again another Gaussian, which is our posterior, with a mean somewhere between the prior and the likelihood, and the variance being a weighted version of the two variances. So the posterior usually is narrower and is somewhere in between the prior and the likelihood. And whether it's closer to the prior or closer to the likelihood depends on the precision, the relative precision of the prior and the likelihood. So here is right in the middle, but if you see the graph in the bottom in B, when the prior is actually flatter, there's a shift of the posterior, in this case the percept, towards the sensory information, because the sensory information is relatively more precise than the prior. So actually this model here, the hyperpriors model, where the prior is sort of flatter or more variable, less reliable, has been proposed as a model for autistic perception by Pelicano and Borg in 2012. And so as you can see here, for typical individuals will be like A. Autistic individuals, if the hyperpriors model was true, would show that perception is closer to the sensory information. And that matches what the Kanizsa illusion, the triangles illusion demonstrate. However, there's a bit of a conundrum here because, and this was described in a response to Pelikan and Boren, also in Tics, and written by John Brock. And what he said was, well, sensory information, likelihood information can, the perception in autistic individuals can be closer to the sensory information or the likelihoods, but for a different reason, not because the priors are flatter or less precise. So this idea of the top-down information being weaker, but because the bottom-up information is stronger. Okay, so that is represented here in the sensory information being sharper or more precise. And as you can see, the effect for the percept or the posterior is the same. There's a shift towards the sensory information. So really there's a conundrum here that it is pretty hard to disentangle these two models. At the end of the day, autistic perception is closer to sensory information than prior, but for two, it can be for two very different reasons, or either. So we were sort of intrigued by these models, and we really wanted to empirically test what's going on here. So this bar is just to indicate how the shift relative to the typical learning. So to recap, the model predictions are for these two accounts are actually quite different, except for the first one, which is that autistic individuals rely more on sensory than prior information. So both of these accounts predict that. However, only one of these accounts predict that autistic individuals have less precise priors than typical individuals, and that's the hyperpriors model. The precise likelihood model, on the other hand, predict that autistic individuals have more precise sensory representations than typical individuals. So really, the question that intrigued me and Roshini Randania, who was a PhD student in my lab, was how do we actually go about empirically testing these models? Because at the end of the day, what we do in my lab is a very empirical form of computational psychiatry, where we are excited about the ideas, but at the end of the day, we want to go into the lab and collect data to empirically test them, and hopefully disambiguate these different models. Okay, so yeah, we were sort of like, okay, how are we going to test these ideas? And fortunately, at the time, I was quite excited about this study by Aris Valaris and in Conrad Cording's lab, which showed very nicely that neurotypical individuals, so this was just a normative population, integrate sensory information and prior information in a Bayesian way. Not necessarily optimally, but we'll come to that at the end. But what they did in this task was to manipulate sensory information to be either with a lot of uncertainty or less uncertainty. So that is represented here in this 2x2 design. So we've got likelihood, which is narrow, so not quite precise, and wide, not very precise, and the same for prior. So let me tell you what this looks like in a task. So, but for now, so it's a 2x2 design, 2 factors, prior and likelihood, 2 levels, narrow and wide. So what people have to do, so they told there's somebody throwing a coin at the center of a screen, and what they see are actually the splashes that the coin makes when it falls on the water. So the splashes can be quite spread out or quite concentrated, but regardless, the person's job is to move the net. So the subject moves the net to the estimated position. Where do they think that the coin fell based on these splashes? And then at the end, the coin is shown to the participant. So this was in yellow here, the true hidden position of the coin. Okay, so what's hidden here is that the likelihood, as I said, can be quite spread out. That's the case here, or quite precise. So this is how likelihood information is manipulated. So again, here the variance is small or narrow, and here the variance is wide or big. So in these situations, as you see, people have to guess what is causing the dots. That's their job. And if they only use the information from the likelihood, they will put it bang in the middle of the dots. But it turns out they're not just doing that, because they were told in the beginning that the thrower is aiming at the center of the screen. So, and they learn by trial and error that that's actually happening, that these dots are more or less, or the true position of the coin ends up being more or less around the center. So they're actually using, as they saw behaviorally, I'll show you in a minute, that people are using that information as well. Now, the prior variance is also manipulated because there are two throwers. And they can see also, again, by trial and error, that one of the throwers is really quite precise in aiming at the middle, and then that's thrower A, and thrower B is actually not very precise. So the true hidden position of the coin ends up being quite far away from the screen as it is here in this snapshot. So here's the visual description of what the narrow prior would be like, and this will be what a wide prior would be like. So that has to do with where the target position ended up being at the end, which they see through feedback. So what have they shown? So these graphs, so this is behavioral data from one individual representative of the population. And what we're plotting, or what they plotted here, was the centroid position, the actual position of the coin. And on the y-axis is the estimated position. So these are people's responses. Every dot is the participant response in a trial in a trial for the four different conditions. So narrow likelihood with narrow prior, wide likelihood narrow prior, narrow likelihood wide prior in red, and then wide prior, wide likelihood in orange. Okay, so the same conditions as this box over here, and I'll use that throughout. So what can we see here? So first of all, we see that the slopes for the different conditions is changing. So that indicates, and that was proved to be significant. So that shows that people are taking both likelihood and prior into account. Also, what I want to point out is if people were just using the prior all the time and ignoring the likelihood, they would always put the estimated position in the middle. So that's not happening. If they were always putting the coin, always taking into account simply the likelihood information, then they would always put the position of the coin exactly in the middle, and that you would see a regression on the diagonal. So that's not happening either. What is actually happening is that the people's estimation of the position of the coin is somewhere in between the prior and the likelihood. And as you can see, if you look at these two are the most interesting conditions to highlight how people are weighting the likelihood and the prior relatively. So if you look at this one, when the likelihood is wide, so likelihood is not very reliable, people actually rely more on the prior, and so you see the slope going closer to the flat line. On the other hand, when the likelihood is narrow, more precise, people rely more on that on the likelihood information than the prior, naturally. So people rely more on the most reliable source of information. So that's how it should be. So again, this is just reiterating that prior sensory reliance depends on their relative reliability. Now, I'm just plotting this again here on the left, and I will just go very quickly through the measures that this paper offered, which is where we saw an opportunity to test our ideas. So first of all is the slope of these plots that indicate the relative reliance of narrowing likelihood. And so we thought, well, we could use this sort of measure to test the hypothesis that autistic individuals rely more on sensory than prior information. So we could quantify it experimentally. The second measure that this paper used was the prior variance. So if you do the maths, you can get into the equation that estimates a subjective prior variance. So the prior variance represented in each individual participant, and that has a relationship with the slope itself, and also the variance of the likelihood, that's sigma L. So that would be very useful to test the idea of the hyperpriors model, whereby Pelican and Bohr say that the prior is flatter, or the variance is bigger. Then the third measure, which actually this paper didn't have, but that was something that Roshini and I came up with, which was a way of estimating people's likelihood variance. So we can assume that people's likelihood variance is the same as by design, so driven by the dots that they see in the scale. But of course, we know that, it's pretty reasonable to assume that our senses are noisy, and so we don't represent the likelihood exactly as we see it. This is our sort of what we postulated for as a measure of the variance, which has to do with how variable people are throughout the experiment in terms of where they put the middle of the target in a no prior task. So we run the same task, but now removing the prior and just having likelihood only, and that's how we came up with this measure. So this measure has two purposes. One purpose is to, rather than assume that people represent the likelihood as it is, it allows for people to be noisy. So rather than having an objective likelihood, we can have a subjective likelihood. And then the second purpose is to test the more precise likelihood model proposed by Brock, so that then we could have really a measure to test that idea. Okay, going a bit slower than I had expected, but there's a lot of theory to go through. So finally, what have we found? So the first findings were actually quite surprising in a way. So remember how we both models said that autistic individuals would rely more on sensory information. So we would expect the slopes for autistic individuals to be closer to 1 than to 0. Okay. So closer to 1 again is relying more on likelihood than prior. what you see here are the slopes for the neurotypical in orange, autistic spectrum in green, and we see absolutely no difference. Okay, so we're like, okay, so actually we managed to reject both models at this stage. But we carry on and looking for the other measurements that you saw in the previous slide, so prior variance and likelihood variance. So yeah, this is just to point out that we rejected both models. So when we look at the different sensory weights by condition, sorry, I'm just getting a bit ahead of myself there, but even though, so I'll just go back to this slide. So even though when we put together all the sensory weights of the different conditions, we see no difference, we thought, okay, let's just have a look at what's happening by condition. And that's what I'm showing you here in this plot. So PN, LN, that means prior, likelihood, narrow, narrow, prior and likelihood, narrow, wide, so narrow, prior, wide, likelihood, and so forth. And again, the same labels, neurotypical in orange and autistic spectrum in green. So when we put together the different conditions, even though we don't see a main effective group, we do see a group by prior interaction, whereby we show that the neurotypical individuals have a larger difference in the sensory weights for wide, prior versus narrow, compared to the autistic spectrum group. So it is a little bit difficult to see here, but what we're saying is that the neurotypical individuals sort of vary more than the autistic individuals. And so the fact that they vary more seems to suggest that, or the fact that the autistic individuals vary less relatively to the neurotypical individuals seems to suggest that there is a poorer context adjustment, right? Because if autistic individuals were taking into account context, they would adjust to that context, in how they weigh the relative differences in precisions of prior and likelihood. So we rejected those two models, but I think we learned something new. The other thing that we wanted to test, our second hypothesis, was around priors. So if you remember, the hyperprior account of Pelicano and Burr said priors are less precise, expect greater variance. In fact, we don't see that at all. And what we see is absolutely no difference, and which we carefully reject the hyperpriors account, or at least we show no evidence for that account at all. So it seems to be that they are intact. In that prior variance is intact in autism. Now, as I said, we had a no prior task, and it's a question mark, and I'll tell you in a minute why. But here we expected to test the more precise likelihood model, but when looking at the sensory weights, we actually saw something quite surprising. Remember how both accounts expected the sensory weight to be greater in autism in the spectrum individuals, and in the first task where we had the prior and the likelihood, we actually found no difference. Well, in this task, we actually did find a difference, but it was the wrong way around. So we actually found lower sensory weights for autism than neurotypical individuals. So that kind of is against both accounts. And in thinking about this, it didn't really make a lot of sense because, well, this was supposed to have no priors. However, when we ran this task with removing the prior, we did that at the end of our task. So we had the main task first with priors and likelihoods, and then we did this one at the end. And so what we think is happening here is that actually people managed to carry over some priors from the first task into the second task, even though they weren't supposed to. And that was more obvious for the autistic individuals. So again, this result is against both hyperpriors and precise likelihood models, in the sense that it doesn't predict that sensory weights are closer to the likelihood. In fact, is quite the opposite. And we interpret this as a carryover effect from the previous to the second experiment. And again, we don't see that this prior is less precise. We actually see that it's more precise. So this is the final results slide that I want to show you. When looking at the subjective likelihood variance, so this is the measure that we postulated for the subjective likelihood, we didn't find a difference when we contrasted the two groups. But when we put people on the continuum, so whereby we align all the individuals, neurotypical and autistic, and we also had another group in blue, which was high on the spectrum, but when we did a diagnostic test with the adults, they really didn't fall onto the autistic, onto the diagnosis, so they're kind of in the middle. But because here we were aligning people on the continuum, it didn't really matter their diagnosis, so we put everyone together. So when we do that, we actually see a significant relationship between the subjective likelihood variance and the AQ, which is driven by the subscale of attention to detail. So this is quite interesting because the likelihood variance is decreasing as autistic traits increase, which is in a sense quite closer to the Brock's model of more precise likelihood. So as the variance is increasing, so it's more precise for autistic traits, as the autistic traits increase. So we sort of tentatively confirm one of the predictions of the precise likelihood model. Although, as I said, when we put people in different groups, that difference doesn't emerge. So we carefully confirm with some question mark that hypothesis or that prediction. So how are we doing with the conundrum? Can we reject, accept, or perhaps revise the models? So here is again the Bayesian account for typical learning and the two models, hyperpriors and precise likelihood. And if you remember, we had 3 different predictions, one around the sensory weights. Both of these models, hyperpriors and precise likelihood model, predicted that people would rely more on sensory information than priors. That did not happen. So that hypothesis was kind of rejected for both models, in fact. So we actually, the first experiment, we see that it's pretty much the same. If anything, the autistic individuals actually rely more on the prior, and that's what we saw in the second experiment. Then what happened to the priors? So we don't really see any difference in the priors, in the prior variance. So we don't really find any support for the hyperpriors model. In terms of the likelihood model, again, we don't see a greater sensory weight. So that prediction isn't correct. In terms of the prior, we see intact priors. So that seems to be a confirmed prediction. However, as I said, in the second experiment, we actually see that there is a shift towards the prior, which could indicate that actually their priors are not less precise, but more precise. And then finally, in terms of the prediction around the likelihood being more precise, we tentatively say, yes, it is more precise, but only when we align people on the continuum. We don't see that when we group them according to diagnosis. So two things that we learned over this study was that perhaps the priors are less precise, not less precise, but more precise, and we conclude that through the second experiment, where perhaps we see carryover effects. And we also saw that there is a poorer context adjustment, which might explain rigidity behavior in autistic individuals. So we sort of confirmed a couple of predictions. I guess our data is closer to the precise likelihood model of Brock, even if not exactly the same. So we propose a revision of the model, but we also have more questions than answers in a way. So, and one of the questions is, are people really Bayesian? And we kind of assume in this framework, because it's quite useful, but we don't really know for sure, and we have some follow-up studies in neurotypical individuals at this stage, actually testing some key principles around being Bayesian. And also the other question is, are people optimal? Actually, they're not optimal at all. They always suboptimal in the studies that we've run, and the question is, why are people suboptimal? And we're currently writing a review paper around trying to explain why is it that people are suboptimal, and perhaps has to do with the biological constraints that we have in the brain that make optimality impossible. And then the last question, to me, it's the most exciting one, is, so how are these computations implemented in the brain? So how is it that the brain leads to these sorts of behaviors where, being optimal or not, Bayesian or not, we do see integration of sensory information and prior information. And the question really is, how does the brain do it? And there's been a lot said about priors being top-down and likelihood being bottom-up, but exactly where these things are encoded and how these computations are implemented through in the different parts of the brain and through connectivity exchanges between these areas is still unknown. So that leaves me to thank Roshini Randini, who led the study, the sources of funding, and all of you for your attention. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? If you do, can you move to the Q&A podium on the right?
I'm not sure if I stopped sharing my screen or not.
You did. I think Kevin has a question.
Okay.
Hello. Thank you for this talk. That was really nice and very interesting. I guess I have some pedantic questions about the like the sample size, and I guess did you do like a power analysis on your experiment as well? And also, what was the, and maybe you mentioned, I just missed it, what was like the kind of diagnostic criteria you used to try to identify people's autistic traits and those without it?
Yeah, so in terms of the sample size, it's not a huge sample size. It's around 20 something for each. Although we actually had more neurotypical individuals than we had autistic individuals, as it's always the case with clinical populations. And it's just pretty hard to get big samples with special, I shouldn't say clinical, special populations is pretty hard to get. But in comparison to other studies, it's surprisingly big in comparison to the other studies that have been done in autism. What was your other question? Sorry.
I think there's a couple. One was about the if power analysis was done, I guess, kind of beforehand or afterhand, and also what was the diagnostic criteria that y'all used to figure out if you had autistic or non-autistic individuals in the sample.
Yeah, so the diagnosis was done with an ADOS interview, so that was run by a clinical psychologist. So the way we did the recruitment was through different organizations and also on campus. And so when people came to us, they would have a self-reported diagnosis of autism. But then we ran or the clinical psychologist that was working with us confirmed that diagnosis for all of them. And as I said in my talk, a few of them did not meet criteria for that diagnosis, even though they were self-reported autistic. So we left those out. In terms of power analysis, no, we didn't do a power analysis for this study. Mostly because we didn't really have anything to base on. This study had never really been done in autistic individuals, so the best we could do was to use the same sort of sample size that had been used for neurotypical individuals. Yeah, no, that's not satisfying, but that was really the best we could do. Of course, now in going into the future, that's something that we can do more confidently.
Awesome, wonderful. Thank you again, and appreciate you answering the questions.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any more questions? If not, I will let Pierre come onto the stage for concluding remarks, and I will thank Dr. Marta Garrido for your wonderful presentation that is closing our conference.
Thank you very much.